Here we are at Possible. I'm at the PayPal Ads Suite with Dr. Mark Grether. Nice to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome to What Just Happened.
Thank you.
PayPal sits on something almost no one else has. Actual transaction data at scale across retailers, not siloed inside one of them. Amazon knows what you buy on Amazon. Walmart knows Walmart. PayPal knows what you buy everywhere. Emphasis on everywhere. That makes it a very different type of commerce media player. And it means when Grether talks about this, he's also making a case for PayPal ads and the horizontal nature of the media network. Welcome.
Thank you so much again for having me. And that was a fantastic pitch. Maybe you should join us, right? And coming to our sales conversation.
I'd be happy to. Let's get into some of where you are now, about almost 2 years into building this. And I'm sure there's a lot to catch up on. The world is less predictable. Change is accelerating and consumers are under pressure and rethinking how and where they spend. Confidence is fragile and payment preferences are fragmenting. Put simply, the rules are shifting really fast. In the 16 months since you've launched PayPal ads, what can you tell us about where we are or where we're going or both?
Yeah, let me start where we are right now, and then we can talk a little more about where we're going. And as you mentioned in the introduction, the power of PayPal ads is indeed what we call our transaction graph. So the ability to see transactions from 30 million merchants and 400 million consumers globally, horizontally across the entire spectrum of verticals. And that gives us a much deeper understanding of consumer behaviors, but also how consumer behavior is shifting. And I come to that in a second. But on top of that, we're not only seeing transaction data with Venmo, we also know how people are sharing what they're buying with friends, right? Who, for example, is sharing a pizza with whom, who's going out to a bar and is maybe sharing an Uber, right? So we also have kind of the social component in our transaction graph. And on top of that, we have Honey, a browser extension, which means we see from consumers where they're actually browsing on the web, what LLMs are they using, where they're shopping even within walled gardens. And you put all of that together, that's what we call the transaction graph, and that basically powers all advertising here at PayPal. And so over the last 16 months, after we basically brought the transaction graph to life, we have now started to first serve ads on our own properties, PayPal, Venmo, Honey. That's obvious, the lowest hanging fruit. But we're really excited now to also bring advertisements from PayPal wherever the consumer is. Not only that, we also went a step further and said, whenever we actually have the opportunity to reach a consumer, whether it might be on the open web, whether it might be on CTV, whether it might be on LLM, leveraging our transaction graph, we want to actually turn that engagement into a shoppable moment. We want to give the consumer the opportunity just not to see an ad, but actually make a purchase. And that, I think, is really important for our merchants. You mentioned that merchants are under a tremendous amount of pressure. They talk about AI. We see that the journeys of consumers are changing. They no longer start the discovery process in search. Most likely, they started on LLMs. Eventually, they make purchases on LLMs or on other platforms. And so the merchants are under pressure to reach consumers. And with the transaction graph, with turning everything into a shoppable moment, we bring back the merchants the opportunity to engage with the consumers wherever they are, as I mentioned, turning every kind of engagement moment into a shoppable buying opportunity.
Let's contextualize the transaction graph, which you coined when you started PayPal ads. I'm not sure, was that in your roadmap or that came about once the technology was available? But before we do that, before we even talk about that, you've contextualized it in the context of Facebook has a social graph, etc. Walk us through that. I want the listeners to hear that from you.
Yeah, I remember when I got a call from PayPal to join and build an advertising business from the ground up, the main reason why I thought that such a huge opportunity is indeed the data that we have and the transaction data we have, as I mentioned, across all the merchants. I came from a ride-sharing company before, and so I only knew what's happening on their platform. Before that, I was at Amazon, same story. I only knew what is happening on that property, and I never had the full spectrum of perspectives. And again, even before I joined, even without knowing that, what the granularity granularity of data that we have, I knew the data is basically the core differentiator, and the fact that it is this idea of horizontality across all merchants. And so therefore it was almost for me obvious, so to speak, right, to build a product around the data. We then use the term transaction graph to show a little bit that this data is indeed about transactions, which at the end is what, let's be honest, the merchants care. Yeah. And so building a business around it and almost working backward from that kind of truth of marketing dollar spend is what really excited me to join PayPal in the first place.
It's really, truly, as they say, a single source of truth or ground truth. And I do feel like now here at Possible, we're really hearing more about the actual dollars and cents. We're moving past intent and nice to have and assumptive into there's real kind of driven conversations about the commerce piece, and you're at the center of that. Tell me about the tech behind building the transaction graph.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you need to think about almost two layers. The first layer is identity itself, right? I need to know who is who. And the big difference, if you think about our own identity, and actually we have launched the PayPal advertising identity here at Possible. Yeah. So the big differentiator when you think about our identity is not just scale. And I mentioned we have 400 million users. It is actually the accuracy of the identity. What I mean by that is from a financial perspective, if you pay me, I need to know that the money actually came from you and not from your, let's say, twin sister. Right? So PayPal over the last 20 years has invested tremendous amount of effort into identification, into fraud, right? To really make sure that you are you. And now we are using that kind of technology as the foundation for a transaction graph by having this identity layer. And then on top of the identity layer, you have then the different kind of data sources. As I mentioned, PayPal, Venmo, and Honey, and they all go into basically the same data management platform that sits on top of the identity. Yeah. And that is, I think, that the trick, it's not just the data itself, it's a data in combination with identity that makes us differentiated and powerful.
And let's talk about some of the conversations around commerce media and some of the challenges facing the industry. Maybe there's not a shared language. Maybe there are differentiating objectives, and the conversation around working together more.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that we see right now from a commerce media perspective is if you put yourself into the shoes of an agency or a brand, there are just too many out there. Right? You don't want to have a media plan with 200 line items because there are 200 or even more commerce media players out there. That's just inefficient and ineffective, right? And so there is a reason for our industry to actually come together and basically, as we join, present a bigger joint offering back to the agencies and to the brands. And the question now is, how do you actually do that? How do we come together as an industry, right? And as I mentioned earlier, we already have identity across the merchants. We already have the transaction data across the merchant. We see about 30% of all transactions, online transactions. We see about 2.7x transactions per second of Amazon. So we already have identity, we already have the transaction data, we already have the merchant relationships, and yet we are actually neutral. And so that gives us the opportunity to help the industry to come together and work together to have almost like one-stop solution for agencies and brands. I think the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, maybe was almost the Wild West of commerce media, right? Everyone was building one because it's cool, it's profitable, it's a thing to do, right? And I think now it's the next level of maturity where we need to your point, come up with joint standards of how we, for example, do measurement. And I do think that the industry has now understood that we are now at a fork in the road where we can either all compete with each other, and then most of us will fail because we just don't have the scale to survive, or we actually all join forces and work together with things like standardizations or just join GTMs. And I think next year we will see much more of that, which again is a natural kind of progression as the industry is going to mature.
And also, let's revert back to what the brands want. It just feels like the business of commerce media and retail media has been in a period of building and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And I'm not so sure brands had a seat at the table because they were willing to try new things. But I think now we need to include the brand leadership, CMOs, et cetera, to help drive that conversation. How do you handle that?
And absolutely. Let's be honest. A lot of retail media in the past was sponsored listings. Right? And to some extent, actually, the retailers forced the hands of the brands to spend more money in sponsored listings, right? Like they did the same in retail stores, right? And I do think now is the awakening that in order for us to grow, we need to look above and beyond just sponsored listings. And that is where the CMO from the brands come into the conversation, because they at the end, they can articulate, they have to articulate, and we need to listen. What is it actually that they do need, right? Which is more than just sponsored listings and maybe boosting, right? And so a lot of the conversations right now that we are having is how can you actually tie back campaigns, let's say in CTV, to actual transactions, right? So that I, the CMO, can justify to my CFO why I actually spent the money in CTV. Yeah. And what's interesting in this conversation is that actually is almost a second step. There's a step before that, which is you go to the CFO first, who typically is the owner of the budget, and he makes a decision most likely based on market share. And he's interested in share shift. He wants to win against the competitors, right? And so coming back to the fact that we have the data horizontally across all merchants, we can show to a brand how market share actually is evolving, what needs to be done to have a share shift, how much money to spend. And then the CFO has now a clear indication how much money he or she should give to the CMO. And then the CMO comes to the conversation, and then it's about, for him and the agency, where to basically best deploy the money. And then conversations like incrementality, ROAS are of consideration, which again, because we have a transaction data, we can help to answer. And so from that perspective, again, getting closer to the CFO and CMO, understanding their KPI, speaking their language, is what we need to do in an industry to mature and to really make sure that we deliver what they really ask us to deliver.
And what did you announce here at Possible?
So we had 2 announcements in the last 2 weeks, right? The first one was our identity graph. So really bringing the 400 million identities that we have based on the fintech kind of underpinning to the market. We have announced that in collaboration with Magnite, PubMatic, Rocked, and Taboola. So really fantastic partners. And on top of that, we've also announced what we called curated ads, which is basically the coming together of CTV campaigns from Warner, from Spectrum, and others with the transaction data, right? So that basically an advertiser can run campaigns on Warner, and then no matter where actually the transaction happens on which merchant website, we can measure it, tie it back to the CTV delivery, and then be able to close the loop and provide full funnel marketing back to the advertiser. So those are the 2 things that we have launched here at Possible.
And one last question. Thoughts on the funnel? It's, I think pretty much people are saying it doesn't exist. It's changed. It's a bit of a pinball machine bouncing around. What are your thoughts in terms of the funnel and changes?
What we see in our data is that there is still kind of different phases of awareness, consideration, and purchase and loyalty, right? Maybe not as linear as it was in the past, but I would say still relatively in that order. However, the entry points where awareness gets generated or where that consideration happens is changing, right? In the past, it was a lot about, let's say, a big TV campaign to create awareness, and then maybe a search came in and so on and so forth. What we're now seeing is that quite often the entry point is actually LLMs. The LLMs are the ones where you start the customer journey, and then thereafter, after you have an understanding of what you might want to look for, you may actually then use search to go eventually deeper, or to look for specific merchants where you can make the purchase, maybe for the best price, as an example, right? And so it's not search goes to a merchant transaction happens. It is more LLMs. Then you go to search and then you check out the merchants where you can get the best deal. And that is what we're seeing, what is happening. And again, it means from a merchant's perspective, you need to be what a consumer is. If the journey starts at an LLM, you need to be there. If it's at a CTV device, you need to be there. It's not just waiting for a merchant by investing into search that they will eventually come to your website and then transaction happens. That's old school. And I think that's more what changes and less so that there is a funnel.
I said that was my last question, but I have another one. So as far as LLMs go, where is that factoring into what you're doing?
Yeah, there are a couple of things, right? The first one is, if you think about LLMs and agents, right? What we unfortunately are going to see is, at least for a certain period of time, the wild west of agents who buy maybe on your behalf, maybe they pretend to buy on my behalf. So it is going to be a challenge from a fraud perspective and whatnot. And hence, the role of PayPal here is, on the one hand, if you want to use a payment method, a one that you actually trust, right? And PayPal was all about enabling consumers to spend money online in a trusted environment. That's how PayPal grew up 25 years ago, right? And the same is now needed as agents are doing the shopping on your behalf, and you want to protect your money. You want to need a platform that you can trust. That's the one piece. The other piece is that LLMs want to make the right kind of recommendations about yourself. And hence, they actually then need transaction data to know what you're actually interested in. And so there will be a race from the LLM's perspective who actually has proprietary data. Some maybe have a head start, others might not be. And I do think you will see more and more collaborations in the future about data, proprietary data, so that others can maybe either catch up or leapfrog into the future. And the last but not least thing is the merchants just need to be there. And they need to make sure that they will be found and be able to be bought. Yeah. And things like shoppability in LLMs will become a big thing. The logistics might still be not happening within an LLM environment. It might still be outsourced to the merchants, but the purchase decision itself very likely will more and more often happen on the LLM side. And that's where you have to be as a merchant.
I want to thank you for your time and all of your great announcements and great insights.
Thank you so much for having me.